Good evening. Welcome to the Tortoise Newsroom. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I don't know whether you ever have this sense that you get blamed for things that are not your fault. I'm going to spend the evening compensating for that by taking credit for something that really has nothing to do with me, and I really recommend it. My name's James Harding. I'm one of the editors and a co-founder here at Tortoise, and we're holding a ThinkIn tonight to mark the launch of our global AI index. And the fact is that it couldn't have happened without a great many of the people in this room. And so partly this is an opportunity for us to think out loud about AI and how it's changing our world and our lives, but it's also partly a chance for Alexandra and I to say thank you for your help in getting us here. If you've not been to Tortoise before, if you've not been to a ThinkIn before, let me just explain to you a little bit about what we're about. So I worked in news at the FT and the Times and then the BBC for years, and I suppose the more I worked there, the more I was aware that there was a swirl of information around us, but I was finding it harder and harder to understand not the breaking news, but what was driving the news. And so the idea of Tortoise was to try to establish a newsroom, not just with a different tempo, as its name suggests, but with a different approach. And the idea was to try to understand those forces that are reshaping our lives, not, if you like, the events in the news, but the developments. And that was rooted in a judgment that if you looked in the last decade, you could make a critique of the news that we'd missed some of the biggest stories, whether it was the financial crisis or the disruption of technology or the urgency of the climate crisis or the rise of populism. These things that crept up on us slightly took us by surprise. And part of our thinking tonight is we can see AI's coming, but understanding what it is and where it is and how it will work is the aim of putting together an AI index. But when I say we also wanted to have a different approach, most newsrooms obsess about storytelling. How are we going to land a story? How are we going to tell it with the most impact? And our thinking was, well, how do we start by rethinking information gathering? How do we start with rethinking the business of listening? And so we've taken a very old newsroom format, namely the editorial conference, and we've tried to open it up. Now, the idea, and I say this with something of a smile this evening, was that instead of just having a bunch of journalists in the room, you would actually get some people in who knew what they were talking about, who had some expertise. Well, we've slightly outdone ourselves today as we have such a room crammed full of expertise, but the principle remains the same. A ThinkIn is an open news meeting where everyone should really feel they have a seat at the table. Everyone should weigh in and try and inform where our journalism goes next. Because the third and final thing we're really trying to do at Tortoise is be a newsroom that takes an interest in what happens next, that we care about the outcomes and we're comfortable about saying so and trying to pursue them. And so I hope that if you haven't been to a ThinkIn, you'll follow our one and only rule. It's not that fiercely enforced, to be honest, but the one rule that we've got is no questions. We want to make sure that everyone says what they think, talks about their experience, brings their expertise to bear. Today we're going to do something slightly unusual because Alexandra and her team have been in a windowless room since the back end of 2018 working on this index. And so just to bring her blinking into the light, we think it would be useful to explain what we've done, why we've done, and how it works. But then I do really want to try and open up to the room and hear from as many voices as possible about where this takes us, where we think we should take our journalism on the subject of AI. A very small piece of housekeeping. You'll see that there are mics hanging and we've got cameras. So if you were about to say something extremely indiscreet, do. But just be aware that there are lots of people who might be able to watch and listen. And we've got an hour. I know that this is a subject that's not probably going to be resolved in that time. But as I see a couple of my old colleagues, one from the FT, another from the Times, a newsroom is an argument on the way to a deadline. And without one, we would get lost. So we have an hour to discuss it. And I did want to say one thing. when you start a new business, when you start something new, not least in news, which, let's face it, is not the safest of endeavors, it is an amazing thing to find that you're not on your own, that there are people who care about what you're trying to do. And when you haven't got a product or even indeed an audience, they're willing to say, actually, we back you in this, and that we back the idea of what you're doing and the people that you've brought together. And we wouldn't be here doing this global AI index if it weren't for a handful of people and businesses who said, this is something that needs doing, and we'll back you, and we hope it half works out. And so I just wanted to say, you know, to Raman, to Maris, and to everyone at Henkel X, a huge and deeply felt thank you. The Minister for AI of Dubai, of the UAE, sorry, is one of the people who made this happen. He's not here, but thank you. And also I wanted to say a particular thank you. Exactly, he's watching. We're going to get to the facial recognition part in a moment. I want to thank you to Mike and to Invoke and to Poppy and the team at Drake Stock, because we wouldn't have done this without them. So a huge and heartfelt thank you. And then finally, there are a group of people at Enterprise AI at the Spanish IE University who've been really intellectual partners for us on this, and we really appreciate it. So, you know, if I ever win an Oscar, that's the kind of speech I'd give. But thank you very much for your patience with my thank yous. Alexandra, before we get actually into the presentation of what we're doing, just tell us why this started, because you've sold me and a bunch of good people on this idea. What was the intention? Oh, sorry, I should have introduced. This is Alexandra Musavizadeh. She is the architect of this thing. Some of you will know her. She is the founder of Tortoise Intelligence.
Oh my God, okay.
It's a tough crowd.
It is. You can say anything on these screens now.
Yeah.
Right, so how did it start?
Yeah.
It was actually the former Danish Prime Minister who called up a year and a half ago, who said, we have established something called the Disruption Council. We are trying to work out our place in the world in terms of how to prepare for a future driven by AI. And he said, we want to know how we're doing in terms of AI preparedness, AI activity, and building AI capacity. We also want to know, how do we compare to our neighbors and countries across the world on this particular topic? And also, how do we enter this race? It's so dominated by the US and China, and as a small nation, how do we fit in? What do we do? And more importantly, how do we benchmark against this? We look at the national statistics, we look at other statistics, and none of them seem to give us the answers that we need in terms of trying to measure what really is going on. So what do we do? So that was a big question to get, and that was the essay question we set out to answer.
So what did we find out? And by the way, someone, maybe it's Mike, it's going to be your job to wave if you can't hear us.
We're fine.
You're fine? Okay, great, perfect. All right, so Alexandra, what did we find out?
So first of all, maybe I'll jump straight to that. First of all, there are many countries that were grappling with the same questions, and actually between 2017 and 2019, 30 countries issued national AI strategies. And many other countries, we've included 54 nations in this index, and these include countries that either have official AI strategies or are considering AI and have voiced this or made investments or positioned themselves on AI. Mm-hmm. So what does it tell us? First of all, maybe how did we approach this? Here's the framework. These are the things that we carefully selected 7 pillars, the core drivers of AI capacity and AI activity. And these include talent, infrastructure, operating environment, research and development, government strategy, and commercial ventures. And the way that unfolds when you look and take a careful look at the indicators that need to go into these 7 driving forces looks a bit like this. You can't read the indicators, it's too difficult. There are many, there are 106 indicators that flow into this index. But I
So,
just...
we had to go through this earlier on. Alexandra said, oh, we've got 104 indicators. I said, well, it says here 106. She said, oh, yeah, they keep on growing. Indicators.
We keep tweaking and we keep adding. But just to give you a sense of the scope and what has gone into it, it's a very large data set. And just to pick out one of the pillars, I've highlighted the talent pillar here. And this is just to give you a sense of the departure from the national statistics, right? So here we have, we're looking at the rails upon which AI is driving, the Python packages down, and we've looked at the big global coding platforms of GitHub and Kaggle and Stack Overflow, where a lot of the activity is taking place. We, of course, look at fundamental capacity in a country, which is seen in the educational outcomes, but we've also recognized that only takes you so far in understanding what the human capital and the talent is in a country to really understand where the activity is taking place. And actually, in real time, you have to go to these platforms where the community is discussing, asking questions, working on code together, collaborating on code across the world. And this can then be geolocated, and this is what we've scraped.
And Ezra, can you just explain, because one of the questions was, and starting with the Danish Prime Minister, was how do you capture data that, if you like, the official statistical authorities are not capturing? So what are official statisticians capturing, and what are we capturing that they're not?
Yeah, so our data set on the official statistics, which would be national statistics on education, there would be some infrastructure statistics. UNESCO has a lot of data that gets released once a year on educational outcomes and how many students go into STEM, et cetera. But that only gets you this far, right? So when you see, that doesn't tell you where the activity is taking place. When you go onto these global platforms and you pull the data using APIs and scrapes, that is where you can see the activity showing up. And you can see that actually countries, and we'll get to that in a minute, but where there might not be a strong formal educational system, this is circumvented by use of online learning systems, but also use of going onto these global platforms on coding. So that also captures that activity, which actually you wouldn't understand really the activity going on in the AI space if you were just looking at the national statistics.
Okay.
So, all those months in the engine room, emerging pale, this is the result of the index. 54 nations ranked across 106 indicators on 7 pillars. And what very quickly emerged was actually these fell into 5 distinct clusters. Unsurprisingly, you would see the US and China as the power players, far ahead of the rest. Next, you have your traditional champions, UK, Canada, Germany, and France. And a very interesting group are the rising stars, among which are Singapore, Israel, Ireland, Switzerland, Finland. And then the countries that we've called the countries that are waking up, that are obviously taking steps in direction of thinking about AI, how to position, but have some challenges in some of the pillars that we look at. And then we've got the nascent countries that we have seen some conversations coming out of the government, some initiatives that have been made, but they're still the nascent countries, as we would call them. So I guess one of the things that was quite striking when we looked at the scores, one thing is to have the rankings and the US #1 and China #2 is not perhaps that surprising. But when we looked at the scores underlying that, what you see here is that actually there's a big distance between China and the US, and probably a larger distance than we had anticipated to begin with. What I think is interesting in terms of looking through the prism of the clusters is also the ones that are just on the cusp from one to the other. And here you can see, I don't know, you can't read from where you are, but the blue, bubble there, the bottom is Singapore, that's sort of pushing itself into the group 2 cluster there. And what will be very interesting going forward now that we have locked this index down is to see how countries might be able to travel from one cluster to the next, and what is it that are the driving forces to move countries from one to the other.
And just out of interesting,
yeah.
On that, the lesson for us is that although we talk about two power players, as things stand, it's still sort of a unipolar world in AI.
Yes, for now. For now, when we look at the rate of acceleration on the Chinese data, that China is obviously, as we all know in this room, is catching up very quickly on certain things, are definitely up and challenging the US on certain aspects of AI. They have surpassed the US. But when you look at China as a whole across the pillars that are the foundations for generating more broadly AI activity and capacity, China's still behind. But there's a very robust strategy in China, and they're moving very quickly. So this might be quite different when we meet again next time in this room. Just to, I guess, depict one of the main reasons that there is this, I love this chart, it moves. But let's do that again. Yeah. It's sad, I know. But so one of these ways in which you can really see where US is pulling ahead is on the private investment into AI companies. Still very, still dominating the scene. China is catching up. There's still a bit to go. And then you've got UK and Israel and Canada following suit right below. But actually, when you shift to official government funding, earmarked funding, not spent, but earmarked funding, that's China. It's a very different picture.
So the big circle is China. I hope you can see that, and the little one is the US. Yeah. But Alexandra, just help us out on that, because the US one looks almost suspiciously small.
Yes.
What's not included in the US circle?
I mean, with all government earmarked official data, you see part of what's going on, and so much of AI innovation and development happens through other channels, which is not publicly available. So that might go through the military spend. In the US, it would go through DARPA. Russia's, has that profile as well for different reasons.
So we have very, very little visibility of military spending, intelligence spending in the realms of AI.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But if we stick to funding for a bit here. If you look at the average funding per AI startup, you see actually that China's pulling ahead here. And then you've got the circles, you've got Japan and the US neck on neck. And that's a slightly different way of looking at it. It looks at, that really shows you the intensity of the investment. So it's fewer companies that are receiving a lot more funding. And we're interested to see how that plays out over time. But if you cut the data that way, you see that actually China is getting a lot of funding. It's just in a different, it's more concentrated. Pulling out the rising stars is always fun. When you then take out the US and China and you look at the countries that may pull ahead of the pack in that group, you have Japan and Israel sitting there in the front. And this might be an early indicator of ways in which countries are going to move from one cluster to another. But it's when you see it this way, you can see that actually there are distances within these clusters, and this is one of the areas that it shows up. So here you see another very important aspect of what contributes to AI activity and capacity is the level of research that goes on, as we know. One way to look at it is to look at the volume. Let me just play that again because we can see where that intersects. Where China overtakes the US in terms of volume of research in 2014, is now way ahead. However, that doesn't really necessarily mean that is creating greater AI capacity in a country. What is a better metric for that is looking at the quality, which we do through something called the H-index, where that is depicting the quality of research by country, where you can see it's a completely different story, where the US is miles ahead. And if you then look at the rising stars again, we have Switzerland well ahead of the rest. And in the middle there, you've got Israel, Australia, and Singapore. So that also might be...
But all of these are lagging miles behind the US in terms of quality research.
Yes, yes. Okay. Now, GitHub, it's interesting. It was interesting for us to see that, it's a well-known global platform for coders and gets used for many different things, but it's the rise in the use of GitHub is clear that since 2015 to today, it's a platform that is more and more in use. This is just for AI, by the way. And it's just, and it just shows the acceleration in the activity on coding and using the coding platforms. But if you pull that apart and you look at how the countries are doing underneath, I don't know how that's just, you saw China coming from nowhere going into GitHub, and then actually if I just play that again, because that the growth of GitHub, you see that there's a switch there between France and the UK. Now China comes up to sit along, well, just under the US, and then you have a switch there, and Germany is suddenly performing, and there's a lot of activity on Germany on GitHub. The problem we know that the issue with GitHub can be quite Western Hemisphere focused, but it is still the best metric for looking at the activity.
Just on that, Alexandra, it's worth pausing the concern we've got amongst some of our data is that part of it is disguised by what is state spending that's not declared, but this other part is whether or not we're biased in terms of language and most commonly used Western platforms.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
We have tried to test that to see what alternatives there are in China to get a different data picture, but actually still GitHub is the best. Okay. So, and also just to remain on the online community of coders, this is Kaggle Grandmasters. This is very advanced. This is quite difficult.
Does everyone know what Kaggle is? Oh yeah, Nigel knows what Kaggle is. That's quite easy. Nigel, what is Kaggle? Will you explain it to us? And sorry, will you just introduce yourself? Sorry, yeah.
Nigel Toon, I'm the founder and CEO of GraphCorp. Kaggle is a competition, basically, where companies set challenges, typically AI focused, but they do other things as well. And people sign up, and companies get data sets, and AI grandmasters and others try and solve those challenges using the data sets provided by commercial companies.
So it's not the perfect, but it's one good proxy for.
It's a very good proxy, and Google recently, about a year or so ago, bought Kaggle, and it's now part of Google.
And it's Apache data set. I mean, one of the things that you have 106 indicators. It is also a decision that we make that we are including many proxies. This one thing won't tell you the whole story, but it's part of the story. And the interesting thing with Kaggle was, someone just said to me this morning, because I said, this is quite surprising. You've got, well, not surprising you have the US in the lead, because it is on so many things, and it also has many Kaggle grandmasters, but you've got Russia right behind it. And he said dryly to me, yeah, but that's because they're sitting and making money at home on Kaggle. Was actually, I think you can actually make money on becoming a grandmaster. And the countries that you would imagine should be there, but actually are not, like China. But it gives you a sense of at least the online people who are participating in this space online.
Okay.
And So Stack Overflow is another one of the coding platforms that are interesting to watch, simply just in terms of trends. And this is where questions are asked on coding and where they're answered. And just to replay that again. You can just see that actually the US is diminishing in its answering on Kaggle, and China is up to meet it in terms of taking over and answering. It's more a picture of that this is now a space that was very driven by US answering and China and India asking, but now it's much more equally distributed. So the focus on patents when you're looking at the area of development is very important, and we can see that patents that are AI related, as we all know, have grown exponentially over the last handful of years. But when you then unpack that and see sort of who they belong to and how that has shifted, then the big circle there is China, and the smaller orange circle is the US. So about 8 years ago, China had about 50% of the AI patent filings, now 7 out of 10. Whoa. So it's again a little bit of a grain of salt, because there are 2 tiers of patent filings in China. Some are easy, some are 20 years, some are 7 years. So this is the grand total. So there could be some on the margins inflation in that figure, but it's still very impressive. South Korea, Australia, Japan also showing up as strong. This is looking at where the supercompute lies. Some feel that it's a very important factor for driving complex AI development, and some are saying it's becoming less important now, because that can actually happen outside of the supercomputing system, but it still plays a role. We did want to include it for now. And here you can see that most of these, or many of these supercomputers lie in China and the rest in the US. But if you then again look at, you take the top 2 out, you have a different picture. You have Japan. You actually have Netherlands and Ireland showing up, which is quite interesting. I'll run through these. So the question is this a new world order? Maybe we're not looking at regions anymore, but we're looking at the world through the clusters on how countries are doing in terms of their AI activity and capacity. So this might be a different way of looking at it, and that brings us back to where we started.
Okay, and Alexandra, before I start asking different people in the room, and some people I've sort of collared you beforehand and say, please weigh in, but actually the truth is I'd love to hear from as many people as possible, you know, in the next sort of half hour, 40 minutes. The one thing we've not done, or maybe we have and you haven't told me, is taken an ethical judgment on AI. We haven't said it's a good thing or a bad thing, or even elements of it are good or bad. So will you just explain what your thinking was on that?
We grappled with that in the beginning. It was something we considered incorporating into the index. We were also very conscious of the fact that the question that was asked in terms of how do we measure activity and capacity just on a pure basis, this would be the best way to do it. The issue of ethics and privacy and regulation are things, or especially ethics, is such an important topic, and the way that you analyze that and you incorporate metrics on that, we felt actually is much better served by doing an index next year on that, so we could have the 2 sit side by side. So you'll have a pure capacity activity AI index, which is this one, just looking at if you just want to have the most activity and the most potential for AI. These are the ways in which, you know, you're looking at funding, you're looking at talent, you're looking at research. This is the way to do it. If you then look at ethical considerations and putting metrics around that, we would have that as a standalone one.
Okay. All right. Who am I going to draw on first? Because what I'm really interested to know is where you think this takes us, as in what that map of the world suggests about how we do or don't regulate AI or coordinate AI. I think it also raises questions about how countries individually marshal their AI strategies, whether or not there is something a little naive about thinking you can marshal a national AI strategy given the global picture, and whether or not in particular the power blocks that we thought had faded away in the last decade or 2 are reasserting themselves in terms of technology. So who would like to weigh in? And remember, this is like a news meeting. All views and opinions welcome. So I'm going to come to you. Would you say your name?
Hello, my name is William from a company called the Academy of Robotics.
Right.
We design and build self-driving cars in the UK. I think any government trying to regulate AI is kind of naive because they don't even understand what it is half the time. For example, when we speak with UK government people about what we're doing and stuff, often they seem to always be 2 years behind or 3 years behind. And so when they're trying to implement something new or use sort of, I don't know, a research and support thing, you think that's 2 years ago. So.
But William, can I just say, there is an issue though, isn't there, which is, that's what we said about the internet, that's what we said about social media platforms, that government didn't have the skills and was not fleet enough of foot to be able to deal with it. And now it feels as though we're catching up with that problem, and if anything, dealing with a bigger problem much later.
Not really. I mean, if you go to social media, it's evolving again. I mean, you've heard of the new, I don't know, first we had Facebook, everyone took Facebook, then evolved, then we went to Instagram, then Instagram, now there's TikTok, which is bigger than Facebook in the space of 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's ever evolving. The moment they try and, it's like trying to catch water in your hand, it'll leak and it'll change, it keeps evolving. So I don't know if government trying to legislate on any AI makes any sense because people just ignore it anyway, or the tech will change because it keeps evolving so quick. So I don't know. It's just my 2 cents on the subject.
Interesting. So, someone with the hat, and I'll come to you, sir.
My name's Paul Atherton, filmmaker, Tortoise member. For me, the issues, the ethical issues are the most fundamentals because obviously in the UK at the moment, the DWP are using AI now to start assessing people. We're having it in legislation where justice is going to be controlled by AI. And decision-making is being controlled in that environment. And I agree with this gentleman here. I think one of the biggest problems with legislation is that the pace it takes to change law, the technology is already advanced way ahead of it.
So your view is that we are going to need some kind of intervention. You're just not confident
that we have the ability to control it at this juncture until the legislation picks up with the speed of technology.
So, okay, now we're going to get it going. So I'll come to you and then I'll come to you, Matthew.
Hi, I'm James Burney. I'm a regulator lawyer at Evershed specialising in blockchain and AI. And one of the things I get asked a lot by companies is they specialise in a type of AI and where it's set up. So if they've got personal data, the US looks good. If they've not got personal data, maybe it's the EU. One of the things I think we're worth looking at is when we say AI by country, are we getting particular types of AI in different types of countries? So if you've got something like smart cars, there are moves in the US behind that. If you've got tokenization of bonds and you're doing the AI around markets, there's a huge market in the UK looking at that particular question. So I think my only real point is when we say AI, can we split it further and go car AI versus bond AI versus robo-advice AI? Because each of those are completely different battlegrounds, effectively.
And can I just ask you, James? Sorry, Alexander, weigh in. One of the questions for us has been whether or not we think a regulatory environment is an inhibitor of AI development or an enabler of AI development. And listening to your point about the distinction between the US and Europe, is that the implication of that is it's an inhibitor?
The world has changed in that before the FCA sandbox, the regulator had the final say. Recently, the regulator, particularly...
So can you just explain the FCA sandbox?
So the FCA sandbox, if you think of it a bit like drugs, the sandbox is where you get to test out once before you can go to the wider market. So it's effectively the same for blockchain type technologies. So for the regulator to understand how to regulate these technologies, you go into the sandbox, you talk to the regulator, they may waive rules, they may get to know your business, but it means that when they actually come to regulate you as a business, they can do it in a grown-up, well-thought-out pattern. That was quite revolutionary, and it was the FCA who did it first. You've now seen other regulators come forward and try to do equivalent ones in their countries, and that's led to a new global landscape where people have realised that if you as a regulator have a well-thought-out regulatory policy, you'll attract more business to your economy, and part of your role as a regulator is for your economy to work well. So as a result, what you're now getting is you're getting competition between regulators. And I've talked to regulators who've come to me and gone, I want to set up a form of regulatory sphere where we will encourage companies in the AI space to come to our country and to set up. And it's a completely different conversation to when you would almost have a regulator, which is how do we achieve what we need to achieve from your regulatory perspective?
Okay. Sorry.
We've seen a lot of Sonja Krohn-Westfried, a collaboration partner of Henkel X. We've seen a lot of fascinating absolute numbers, investment, patents. But if you take a ball of 100 kilo, and if one person lifts it, or 10, or 100, it makes a difference. So you're comparing China, which has 1.386 billion, with the United States, which has 326, with Israel, which has 8.
Yeah.
So that goes down, I think, to the human power of individuals. And that's actually the second point I wanted to make. I don't want to go like who in this room knows. But artificial is a word from the 14th century, which is French, which originally had roots in Latin, which means art and means made by man. And I think many of us forget. I think if you go perhaps not in this round and we speak about artificial, people think about technology. But at the end, and that's what we are doing here with Henkel X, it's the human intelligence which drives the artificial intelligence.
But Sonia, can I just make a point? If I'm right, Alexandra, the slide that showed the Chinese model of investment suggested that it wasn't the fact that there were thousands and thousands, even millions and millions of Chinese enterprises in AI. It was fewer bigger bets in China by comparison with the US model.
Yeah, sure. I wasn't referring to this chart, but general. I think somehow to factor in the amount of people who collect absolute investments or who create patents.
I used to live in China, and I remember they used to do these occasional surveys of what the Chinese population thought was the population of other countries, and Israel always topped 100 million. That was always what people thought was the population of China, but I guess they thought it was a small country.
But I think to that point, I just wanted to maybe Andrew Haynes here on my left, who is part of the team and the data scientist and really built a lot of this index. And in terms of the, we looked at the index in terms of what you're saying, in proportion to, in proportion to the population as a share. And I just want to maybe hand over the word to Andrew to explain how we did that.
Sure. So we looked at 3 different ways of measuring.
Andrew, will you just speak up so we can hear? Yeah.
We looked at 3 different ways of measuring a lot of these variables. The first is, as you say, the raw capacity. That's if you've got 100,000 data scientists, then you can do 100,000 data scientists worth of work. We've also considered the portion of total capacity worldwide. So if you've got 100,000 data scientists, there's 200,000 data scientists worldwide, you've got half of the world's capacity, and it's a limited resource. We've also considered as well that if you've got a small population, if you've got a large number of data scientists for your little country, that means you're doing really impressive work, and it gets you on the stage to talk with other people. So we've considered all 3 elements when building the index.
Thanks, Andrew. Certainly.
Hi, so James Lawson from Data Robot. We have an automated machine learning platform. We've built 1.4 billion models across the enterprise, so one of the leaders in the private sector space, I'd say. Speaking in a completely personal capacity, because it might be a bit controversial, I find it interesting that China are doing so well on the government strategy part of this index. So they're number 1, whereas the United States is 13th. And I would have thought it would be the other way around for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because China has concentrated investment in a few big bets, and that's traditionally a very bad approach to innovation. It's much better to put lots of little bets and fail fast. The second is that China is so heavily reliant on government funding, and government traditionally hasn't been as good at this sort of thing than the private sector, with the exception of when you're doing one mega project, like let's send a man to Mars. That might be something that's better done by government, potentially. But then the third reason is China seems to be perhaps the least concerned or even counter to the ethical considerations of AI, which I think is very worrying from a government strategy perspective, in that just the other week we saw in the news that China is using AI to basically help with the internment of part of its Muslim population, and a lot of very controversial stuff happening there, whereas you wouldn't see the same sort of thing in the US. By contrast, in the United States, their approach to technology and AI since the Clinton era has been one of what I call permissionless innovation. So permissionless innovation. So traditionally, governments follow the precautionary principle. Let's not allow it to happen or regulate it first, just in case it does harm. Whereas the US, they've essentially inverted that principle with the internet and said, go out there and build things, and if something bad happens, we'll come at you afterwards and regulate based on the lessons learned. And I think that's generally been one of the reasons why the US has done so well in the internet and is doing so well in all of the other indicators in terms of AI, which I would link to government strategy ultimately.
But can I just ask you, James, it seems to be one of the central questions posed by this. I remember Eric Schmidt of Google said a year or so ago that he thought the 21st century argument was going to be between the Chinese model and the US model, between state enterprise and private enterprise. Actually, what this suggests is that is going to play out in the AI field. They're just two fundamentally different approaches to investment and innovation. And how confident are you that that market-led model, that permissionless innovation, is going to prove the successful one?
So personally, very, very confident. I think if you look at the history of economic innovation since the Industrial Revolution, that approach has worked much, much better. It's essentially what got us out of the default state of mankind, which is absolute poverty and misery. There were a few clusters, like obviously the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance, where you had a lot of competition in ideas, but fundamentally that approach I personally think is much, much better. We see it within DataRobot, right? We have a load of competitors, and when I look towards China and see who's competing with us there, at best they're just stealing our intellectual property. I don't really see them as direct competitors.
Just returning to the ethics, which is, I think,
So what's your name?
Hi, Desno Marcy. Just returning to the ethics, I mean, especially given all the sort of hidden information, military intelligence, and I think, for me, we're dealing with data, and I think the data avatar of the self, the individual, is the thing that I'm most worried about. If you think about the fungibility between health tech, financial services, and all these tech companies that are now encroaching onto things like healthcare, wearables, and so on, and how the individual might get excluded from goods and services because you may not want to have a data avatar. That's just the one point. I just want to throw that open as a point. You know, that's very worrying, and how things become misinterpreted and biased and so on. And then just the other thing was...
I can't understand this. When you talk about a data avatar, what you're talking about is, if you like, a sort of data clone of your own...
Yeah, your digital self online, you know, like what an insurance company might use if it's James Harding's, you know, I don't know, what do you call it, your BMI and et cetera, et cetera.
So my data doppelganger that you're in.
Exactly, but that might be applied in different ways for different products and services. Then just another point on the ethics, maybe when you do next year's one, there are many nations. Singapore constructed the world's first financial services AI ethics framework. And there's quite a few countries that have done AI ethics frameworks. We were looking at this quite a lot at Global Council, and the stuff, and that's been led by GDPR, as James was saying. The legislation around GDPR, because we are dealing with in the world of data, and I think that's kind of just to take a step back and think how that informs the ethical frameworks.
Sir, we'll come to Mark. I'll come to you. Gentleman after you.
James.
Yeah.
I'll pass the baton.
Yeah.
James, Alexander, and the team, thank you very much, because this is a daunting task. I've got my super duper glasses and I can see all the factors you've put in and et cetera, so it's just amazing. But first, I want to move on the discussion from, I would say, the ethics of AI, which is going to be an issue, and which is, you know, it's like the ethics of a car has been an issue when you start with one car in the UK with no speed limits, and then suddenly you could have 10 million of those. So regulation will come, and it will be welcome. Big task is the speed at which it will need to come. But here in the components of what you're talking, there are many parts that are very interesting for many of us. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself, so Marc Deschamps. I'm leading an investment bank in the field of technology for growth companies. And AI is a big component of that. What is, I find we were talking about China and China intervention directly. Other governments are involved, but indirectly or by creating an ecosystem that promotes AI. And and many of them are realizing, and that's why you see many governments here and people involved, and that's why you will have big audience, is that there will be the have and the have-nots. There will be the creators and those that will use. And the countries that need to define their economy system in the future need to realize the importance of AI and where they need to go. And therefore, based on these indexes, I think that people will have to realize what ecosystem they need to build, what policies they need to build around. And that may go not only, and you were talking per capita is an interesting angle or different dimension for this, or dimension to this, but there is also the cities. Because what we know is that technology is also the youth out there. It's the young people, it's the creators. It's those that are better than us.
So even within these nations, you're going to get really tight clusters.
A country like France is vast. Yeah. And I'll talk about one where there's a lot of government being involved in different ways than China, but very interesting. But France, there's Paris, there are other clusters, but there's the rest. Yeah. Similar to Canada, you will have different cities with different importance. And that's because of education, that's because of capital invested in AI, etc. One point for me is core in this, may it be government, not government, etc., or corporate, is the capital going into AI to accelerate its development.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. There's a gentleman next to you. Yes,
Roberto Zeccari, I'm the founder of the...
Sorry, what did you say, sir?
Roberto Zeccari, the founder of the Big Data Lab in Frankfurt. Microsoft Research has done a study recently among machine learning people, and they figured out that most of the technical people that spot some ethical issues, they don't have any support from management. That's a really big concern. So there are not really there's no any incentive strategy for people to look at ethical issues. So I have a suggestion for the next index.
Yes.
Which is, if you make an index which is, focused on ethics, this could be used for investors and say, well, I'm investing in a company if it's fitting this criteria. So you can turn the index in a tool, it's like a certification tool, and say, okay, you want to invest in this company or this technology, because technology comes from places, and in some places, democracy, for example.
And so, Roberto, just forgive me, there's what we would in my line of work call a story there. When you say that there are people who within these AI companies are raising ethical issues, yes, but they get no support from management, yes, is that a feeling, or is that...
No, it's a survey done by Microsoft Research. There's a paper that is published. And basically, one of the key factors for an engineer, like a machine learning engineer, there is not any incentive to go to the manager and say, hey, boss, what we're doing is bad. And what happened? Uber killed a person last year, right? Who's responsible?
Sorry, did you say the paper was by?
Yeah. Who was it by?
Microsoft Research.
Microsoft Research.
Microsoft's own research. Okay, I'm going to come to Chairman with you. I'm going to come to you first, Roman, and then I'm going to come here. There's a slew of them across the front. Roman.
So, Ramin Kress, X Ventures. First of all, it has been fantastic to have been part of that journey and finally see something on the slides. I think, when I reflect on that, and that has been sort of the biggest desire and wish, I think it is a starting point of a baseline. And it is bringing visibility to all of us to have a conversation, and it starts with a conversation. I think there are a number of avenues that can come out of it, whether it is ethics, etc. One of the things that it does, it shows us very clearly the house is on fire, and we can't wait until regulatory reforms are making or giving us guidance to finally start doing something in the space of AI. So it's not a secret, I say it very often. I'm one of the individuals who has slept through the internet in the media industry 3 times because we were ignorant, arrogant, uninformed, and we lived in our own little silos. But I remember one of the conversations when there was a hunch that the internet may have a future. And I was told at a certain point, Ramin, don't put too much emphasis on it. Don't invest too much. We don't know if it's here to stay. So with that in mind, I think, 20 years later, we know what happens. And I think here we have a huge opportunity to be part of it, but maybe more than the opportunity. And I represent a large DAX company, of which I was the CDO, and now we're driving investments with a view to make Europe a better place through collaboration and innovation. And what this does is it shows us our place. It shows us the amount of talent. It shows us that we need to act now. And with all of that said, I think it is an amazing starting point. And maybe what Roberto was saying, and also I believe Mark, investment bank Mark. Yeah. Yes. We need to take this really, really serious, and we need to do this collaboratively. The importance of large corporate companies, and I would say here, our social corporate responsibility to act, invest, take points of efficacy very early on board, but not just take it on board, but be part of shaping it. That is one of the things we want to do, and I think this sets just such an incredible tonality and baseline where we can move from. So thank you. I'm very grateful.
Amel, I'm going to come to you, and then I'll come to you, sir, and you over there. Yes.
So I'm Amel Karabul. I'm the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund for Africa and Middle East and member of the Global Tech Panel. I think two things come from this discussion for me. So one side is I call the light side of AI, which is this huge opportunity to get education and learning in a personalized manner for a lot of people. We have 5,500 days before 1 billion young Africans enter the job market, and the question is, how are we going to get this cohort of young people to be the leaders and innovators and educated? And AI is totally underutilized. So it's not, I want to challenge the new world slide there, because it's maybe still the old word, because if you look at education, I would be curious to see how much investment is in AI in education versus now the other side, which I work with on the Global Tech Panel, which is the dark side, which is semi-autonomous and autonomous AI weapons, where there is a high need for regulation and where actually AI players themselves. It's interesting you said that employees don't get support from their bosses, but I have met even CEOs of those companies who say, please regulate us, because even as CEO, we are not really incentivized to look at ethics when we work in AI. So, and the bigger question which we came up, at least in the Global Tech Panel, is how can we get policymakers and government to understand more AI? And that is really kind of, we have to educate ourselves. And for me, the biggest story or picture I've seen is Risto Salzman, who's with me, a member of the Global Tech Panel, stood in front of 28 defense ministers of the EU in Finland in a meeting, and he said, you can't delegate this. He said, as a chairman of Nokia, I sat down and I did a MOOC, and I'm learning myself about machine learning and AI.
But
and
the chairman of Finland went to a MOOC to do this?
Yeah, chairman of Nokia.
Finland, chairman of Nokia, sorry.
He said, I'm learning myself. and he said, I'm taking courses, I'm taking MOOCs, I'm learning, I'm going back to learn about this because I can't be the chairman of such a big company that I not know enough. And he says, you 28 defense minister, you can't delegate this. You have to sit through courses to be able to make the right policy decisions of, in AI. And I think that's a big message for any government.
Funny enough, Amel, I have to say that Andrew told me today that I could do an AI course, Stanford, Coursera, £59. Just a small plug for them. If you want to sign up, do it. Who did I say? I said I would come to you, sir, and then you back, and I would come as well. So.
Thank you, Simon Anholt. I published the Good Country Index. I love indexes.
Good. I love your index. I love your index.
You love mine. One of the things that keeps me awake at night about rankings of countries is that there's something very old-fashioned about them. What they do is they play into the Westphalian idea that life on Earth is a race between countries, and who's going to get there first. Now, given all the anxieties that we all have about the uses of new technologies in the future, are they going to be shared, the benefits of them, equally, or is it just going to be another way for the rich world to pull even further away from the poor world? So just a little suggestion for the next edition, and this is a suggestion I'm going to take myself as well as my own indicator. Can we, as well as measuring competition, also measure collaboration?
Yeah, good idea. Very nice idea.
Do.
Thank you.
We do. Actually, can I just jump in there?
Jump in.
But Andrew, maybe you should just explain that we do actually look at collaboration and how collaboration, particularly between right now the US and China, maybe you want to just dive into that?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of work on collaboration with some of the larger companies around some of these platforms, so kind of GitHub and research as well, despite what's going on in government tensions or government relations, our developers or researchers still working together, and it looks like collaboration is an all-time high, and we see that the diversity is increasingly high as well.
Well, let's just make sure that's part of the story we tell.
And one thing I should say, Simon, what we're trying to do is also, when you do go on, whether you look in the app or on the website, is also point out some of the research that many others have done. For example, Element AI have done a lovely job of looking at who moves from which country to which country in terms of where they work, who employs them, where they study. So there's a lot of interesting movement in that. So,
yes, I'm coming from the continent that is part of the nascent one. I'm from Kenya, right?
Okay. Welcome. So what's your name?
My name is Oswald. I'm from Liquid Telecommunications, so we're part of this whole AI discussion. I've got a couple of points I just jotted down here. I think you mentioned something about China. So recently we visited Alibaba, Didi, BYD, and Huawei in China. And one thing that we discovered about the Chinese growth of AI is a factor of the inputs of AI, which is data. Yeah. Chinese 1.6 billion people. Most of them are highly, highly digital. I think if you've been to China recently, you can't even use your credit card. It's all Alipay and WeChat. So they're generating so many data points that will enable them to probably conquer this AI world in the future. So I think it's all about digital transformation also that enables that. And the level of infrastructure, like the 5G investments they're making, and the data centers, the cloud. So you can actually see that there's a lot of Chinese government strategy around supporting them within the infrastructure side of things. That's my first point. The second point I wanted to mention was, in your indexing, I think there's a point you make about infrastructure. And from our experience, I come from a telco background, and I do agree with you that telecommunications right now, be it cloud, connectivity itself, and data centers, are the things that are really supporting the growth of AI. Yeah. You will see that in our continent, in Africa right now, there is so much investment in undersea cables that is happening today. Google is building a cable straight from New York into Africa. They want to be so close to that data so that they can pull it back into the US. They're only 350 million people in the US. They're not going to create a lot of data points to really run those algorithms to be super algorithms. So I do believe that in your indexing, it's very important to also showcase the level of investment around things like connectivity, data center, and cloud, and how it enables that. The other part I wanted to mention was the educational side. I think in our continent, there's a lot of drive around education on AI a lot, which is digital. You know, these MOOCs, all those digital platforms that are coming up. As a company, we've built one. We've recently trained about 500 data scientists working with Microsoft in across 10 countries in Africa. Next year, we want to train 1,000. The next year, 5,000. So there's a growth within the African continent in terms of the drive towards AI. And I do believe that very soon we might be part of those, is it rising stars or something like that, waking up. Because I do believe, I do believe that as a continent, there's so many things happening. We are very young than most of the continents in the world. We've got the future in terms of the youth divide, the youth opportunity that they talk about. So I do think we'll definitely have something to talk about. The last point I want to mention is, in your indexing, I do believe there is an opportunity around how AI is supporting the development world.
Yes.
Because I do believe there's a lot of merit that can come out of it.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to come to, who have I pointed to? I said I would come to you, sir, and I'm going to come to you at the back, sir. Yeah.
Elliot Jones, a researcher at think tank Demos. You were talking about the US versus the Chinese approach earlier, and like following from what you were saying about collaboration, I feel like this index maybe hides the role of the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, the new president, has said there'll be, in the first 100 days, like investment and regulation around AI. There's a lot of intra-European collaboration on AI, and the single market means that skills and capital can flow quite easily through the European Union. So I'm wondering if if you took the EU as a bloc together, because it is somewhat different from individual countries, would they stack up to the US and China? Would it be a three-player world?
Yes.
Very quickly. A lot of the studies out there look exactly at what you're saying. They look at China, they look at US versus Europe. But when we're trying to, when each individual country is trying to set its own strategy and decide where its place in the world is, yes, it is going to be a taker of a lot of the policies that cover all of the EU, but there has to be a national, there is the desire for a national strategy underneath that, and that's what we're trying to address. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a way to look at it is looking at Europe as a bloc.
It's not because you're based in London, huh?
It creeps into everything. So there's a gentleman.
Hi, Saul Klein, early stage investor. It's sort of more a question than anything else, and either people in the room.
They're not allowed unless they're rhetorical or very good, Saul.
There's an assumption, I think, inherent in these kind of rankings and sort of the way people think about AI in general is that more is better, particularly more data is better. And I mean, obviously, I think we assume that that's one of China's great advantages. As you think about ethics and AI, presumably diversity within a data set is important. And, you know, how do some of these countries rank from that perspective? I mean, if you look at where the pharmaceutical industry today is in terms of the drugs that it's developed by effectively using a data set of 10% of the population to develop drugs for 100% of the population, you know, that's not necessarily ending well. So sort of diversity as a question, and then for people like, I mean, Mike would probably know the answer to this. Is there a diminishing return in terms of data sets, in terms of how large a data set is from a training data perspective, i.e. more is not necessarily better because it doesn't produce better results because they're diminishing returns, and B, you know, and a data set lacking in diversity isn't necessarily either ethically desirable or even that useful.
Yeah. Mike, you're right behind Saul. Do you want to shout?
Yeah, the thing about the data set is not its size. It's, I think it's much more to do with whether it's realistic. So, you know, if you want to teach an AI to do something on a London street, then what you want is a lot of the London street. It actually raises a slightly counterintuitive point about diversity. If your goal is to get maximum accuracy on a London street, actually you want to train it on a London street. If you then want it to work in Shanghai, you want to train it on a Shanghai street. And so the idea that if you have an unrepresentative diversity in your data set, you're getting a better system is actually probably counterintuitively the wrong way to go. You want something which is as true to what the question is. And that brings you to one of the key things to think about, I think, with AI, which is everyone talks about the answer, what the system will do, what we want it to do, what the ethics are. AI is a bit like a genie. It's actually all in the question. It's what do you set out to ask it to do for you? And that is the different way in which we need to think about these things if we're actually going to address some of the questions. Because if you get the question right, the AI will deliver on that to within technical limitations. Normally what's wrong is the question that's being asked is wrong.
Okay. I'm not trying to come to you. There's a lady right behind you, and I'll come to you now. Yes.
I think that
Sorry, what's your name?
Sophie Gusens, lawyer specializing in technology as well. And I think the point about the data set is something that is really essential and potentially something when we were talking about whether government are hindering or helping, the access to data set is actually a metric that is really important. Because you see governments who are spending a lot of money on education, having amazing AI experts, a lot of money on incubators, on grants. But then when it comes to accessing data set, they are not doing the same things, or at least the positioning is much more, let's say, conservative. Because you have a lot, especially in Europe, when you look at data sets, you can have a lot of conflicting interest. You can have a lot of personal data in a data set, which means you're not free to do whatever you want to train your AI on. You can have a lot of copyright protected material in a data set, and when you have that, are you able to use it? How can you use it? Where do you find it? And that's where you see countries like China or other countries which make it super easy for their scientists to access data sets without any of those restrictions. And you have other countries where accessing the data set might come with a lot of restrictions or headaches that you will not have in certain other countries. Okay. So actually measuring what are the different types of challenges in accessing the data sets might also be quite interesting in regard. Okay, on top of the ethical question, but in relation to the global index.
We've run out of time. I'm going to have two final things. Nigel here and the gentleman with his glasses who's kept on smiling at me. I think there's a contribution, may just be a smile. Yes.
I wanted to come back to something that Mike said, which I think is very important here. So first of all, I think what you've proved with this index is that AI is existential. You know, it's absolutely fundamental. We're just at the very beginning, and this is existential threat, benefit, whatever it is, but it is a function of our existence going forward. I think the second thing is, which relates to all the ethics and comes back to what Mike was saying, is that the ethics will be related to the values that the different countries have around how they're going to use the AI. And we can, you know, with no disrespect to my colleague here from Kenya, there's really, you could split it into three pieces, I think. There's obviously China has a certain set of values, the US has a certain set of values, and Europe has a certain set of values. And they're very different in terms of how they view, how they might use AI. And I think this really comes down to, you know, then that existential issue of, you know, are we as Europe moving towards digital sovereignty and all these other things that get talked about? Are we heading to a world where AI is very regulated? Are we ending up in a world where China's values say AI is for the state and what the state will use to try and control its population going forward? And are we moving to a world where the US says AI is for commercial benefit and is how we're going to commercially rule the world? And I think, you know, those are the issues that are really laid out here.
Okay, no, thanks very much. So
my name is Manuel Nunes. I'm an academic at IE University, and I'm very happy to have worked with Alexandra and her team on chunks of this and also moving forward. So for just a comment to reinforce the EU point, because I think that in this space actually scale is very important, and the EU has appointed a very powerful VP on this issue, Vestager, that's going to try and push this agenda forward, because without scale, I mean, comparing Luxembourg to China, it's a bit like comparing Rhode Island to China. I mean, it's, these are such small actors, right, that I think that there is a point to be made on the scale. And then on the second, as an international relations scholar, the China-US piece is of such relevance, because a lot of us are looking at the China-US collision on trade and on a whole range of issues through the tech lens. I mean, we live in a G2 world when it comes to technology. You can see this if you look at the 20 largest technology companies in the world. They're all American or Chinese. There are no European firms on that list. If you look at the distribution of large startups in the tech space, almost all of them are actually, the majority are in China and the US. So it's looking like a very clear collision between these two powers. And actually AI and other technologies make competition in markets very oligopolistic, if not monopolistic. They have these forces that make competition very tough. So I think keeping an eye on that race between these two countries is going to shape, I mean, that relationship is going to shape geopolitics. It already is. And actually doing it through the lens of AI, I think gives a very clear insight into a lot of the issues that are driving that relationship. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, listen, I am in a race against time, one that I generally lose, and again this evening, as you can see, our little tortoise, well, if you can see the screen that I can see over there, our tortoise Agatha has crossed the finishing line, and so I'm afraid we have to wrap it up, and there are a few people, I apologise, I didn't manage to get to in the course of our conversation. I hope you'll hang around, talk to each other, meet people. One of the beauties of these things is it's sort of a kind of dating service for people with similar interests. So come together. Journalistically, I suppose we will, and Alexandra and I will sort of reflect on the conversation this evening. I think there are three really kind of obvious things that we would kind of take away on the, if you like, to-do list. I think the first thing is, I think the point that, James, you made at the top, which is drive deeper. Go deeper, make greater distinctions. The logical conclusion of the map is that actually we're going to see specialization in AI, and we need to track that. It picks up on Mark's point about ecosystems and the nature of the clusters in cities. And Ramin, you would kind of say this is a starting point. I think the idea of driving deeper will make a big difference, and I hope that we'll be able to track specific kinds of AI. I think, Amel, that hopefully we'll actually be able to look much more closely at what you rather worryingly describe as the light side and the dark side. But I think the distinctions between AI and education, or AI for military or surveillance purposes, is obviously very significant. I suppose the thing that is most obvious is the appetite that we all have to try and understand, A, the ethical considerations, and B, the ways in which those can be meaningfully addressed by not just government, but obviously primarily government. And it seems to me that we talked about that in three contexts. There was, if you like, the kind of William Paul question, which is, can you trust legislators to be able to deal with this, or are they going to come at it always 2 years too slow? I was really struck by the idea of competition in the regulatory sphere, and competition, whether it's in sandboxes or whether it's, as Elliot, you point out, in kind of, in the EU-US context. But I do think that the point that you touched upon and the conversation that bounced, I suppose, between Oswald and Sophie and Saul and Desno around data sets and whether or not we're talking about the kind of protections we need to ensure that people do have, Desno, to your point, equal access to goods and services, and they're not distorted by those data sets, but also to understand whether or not we're looking at data sets that are representative and the power of not just scale but diversity. That seems to me to be a regulatory issue as well. And then, of course, I think I and my former colleague from the Times and former head of the Downing Street Policy Unit, our ears pricked up too, Roberto, at the issues that sit within companies. That the idea that there's got to be a mechanism for people to raise ethical concerns within companies. So I think on the ethics side, we will take that away and we will look to incorporate that in next year's index with an eye to legislation, regulation, and the corporate. And then the third and final thing, I think, is just understanding the nature of the power dynamic as you move further into the 21st century. And personally, the idea of understanding the US-China race and where we are on AI obviously is really meaningful in understanding finance, in understanding business, but clearly understanding, military and security capabilities. I think there is a real question about the rest and understanding where the rest lies. And that's why I think whether you're nascent or you're a wake-up or you're one of the other rising stars, that the nature of what the rest do and how those rules are at the moment overwhelmingly set by the US, but the rest responds is really interesting. I thought that, Simon, your point about tracking collaboration is a really useful thing. We've begun to look into it, as Andrew says, but actually tracking it would be very useful. I thought that also beginning to think about blocks of countries in that context, again, to your point, would also be a really useful thing to do. I do take away from all of this the sense that we all journalists, not just those of us at Tortoise, but everywhere, we are really at the beginning of understanding something that, Nigel, as you say, affects everything, both the benefits and our fears in society. And I suppose the sort of eerie feeling I get at the end of this is when Mike says it all depends on the question you ask, is that I'm not sure that I, or necessarily institutions of government or leaders of business, necessarily have the skills to be able to frame the questions that have the foresight to understand how the machines will develop in response to those. And so I suppose one of the things we're trying to do here is for us to get a better understanding of AI so that all of us, citizens, politicians, people in business, just regular folks can get a better understanding of it. And with that in mind, I wanted to say one final thing, which is, as you can imagine, the joy of this is that it seems impossible to do. And it's been a fiendishly complicated thing. And as I said at the beginning, I've had next to nothing to do with it. And the reason that it's been such a pleasure for me is Alexandra and the team that we've treated with, due respect here, who are sitting at the back, Alex and Luke and Andrew and a bunch of other people I know who've contributed, have brought together a huge amount of data, a huge number of indicators. So I hope you will join me in doing something we haven't done at Tortoise here, but giving them a huge round of applause for the work they've done. And a final shameless plug, we've figured out that often you find a subject that is too big for 1 hour. We're going to, in the new year, hold a summit just on AI, a morning where we can try and dig into this in a deeper sense. We will follow up with you to try and say, come and join us. Obviously, that'll be much easier if you're Tortoise members. So do sign up now. Don't miss your moment. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Have a very good night. Thanks a lot.